And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. And on this podcast, we're going to continue to talk about government policies to deal with externalities. And I said on a previous video that there were 4 ways to do this, really kind of 3 ways to do this. One that kind of got split into parts. The first way was regulation. This was the command and control. The second way was a Pigouvian tax, and this kind of gets split into 2 parts. You could tax the good that was causing the pollution, or you could tax the pollution itself, and that's kind of more like a fine. And then we said there was the Kosian solution, where you create some sort of new private property right. So those we talked about on the previous video. So what we want to look at now is we want to look at what the graphs look like for these. So we're going to look at the example of, and I'm sorry, this is a little, see if I can move this over here a little bit. Okay, this should say widget right here, and a widget is just kind of a pretend good that economists often use to talk about. So that just says widget up there. So there are 3 ways to deal with these pollution problems. Actually, there were 4, as I said, the command and control, but we're not going to do a graph on command and control. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a graph for a Pigouvian tax on widgets, which we're going to say is the good that the company is producing that's creating the pollution problem. And then we're going to look at a graph where we put the Pigouvian tax on the pollution itself. This is kind of the idea or the concept of a fine. And then we're going to look at the Kosian idea, where we're going to create a new private property right. In this case, we're going to create a private property right to pollute. So let's get at it. So the first one right here is taxing the good that creates the pollution. So that's going to be this graph right here. We're going to tax the good that creates the pollution. So what we have here is, and I've done this graph on some previous podcasts. This is our normal Pigouvian tax. Here's my good as widgets. And it's really, really important to say what the good is. What is the good that we're going to be putting on the horizontal axis? It's going to be a really big deal here. So the good that we're talking about is widgets. Widgets, it's the production of widgets that creates the pollution, which is the negative externality problem. So we're going to tax that good widgets, okay? So we got quantity of widgets on the horizontal, we got price of widgets up here on the vertical axis, and then we had a private supply curve for widgets. And we have a social supply curve for widgets, and I'm sorry that's kind of cut off a little bit up here, but that's just a social supply curve up there. And to solve the problem of the negative externality, where there's a difference between the private supply curve and the social supply curve, we are going to tax the good that is creating the negative externality. That means we're going to tax widgets. We're going to tax the widgets, and that will do. We did this on a previous video. That tax is just going to shift the supply curve up by the amount of the tax, and that's going to reduce the quantity from Q1 to Q2, where Q2 is the social optimum. So that's what this says right here. It's the social optimum. So we're going to reduce output down to the social optimum. We're going to reduce output down to the social optimum by taxing the good that creates the negative externality. Okay? So that's the first one. The good is the good that's creating the negative externality. Second graph, that's this one down here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to tax not the good that creates the negative externality. We're going to calculate the externality itself. We're going to tax pollution itself. Okay? We're going to put a fine on pollution. And assuming that the fine is a constant amount, maybe the fine is $100 for every barrel of garbage that a company dumps into the environment, if that's the case, then our supply curve is going to be perfectly elastic. Our supply curve is going to be perfectly elastic. But you say, supply curve for what? Well, we got to come down here and talk about the good. So this is going to get kind of weird. The good here is going to be pollution itself. And I have that written here. The good is pollution itself. So again, I'm going to say this again. Up here we were taxing the good that created the pollution. Here we are now analyzing the supply and demand for pollution itself. Okay, this is the pollution itself is the good. So we have a downward sloping demand curve for pollution. The lower the price, or in this case, the way to think about it is the fine is really the price. The lower the fine, the more pollution companies are going to engage in. That's like a downward sloping demand curve for pollution. And then the fine itself is the supply curve. That's right here. The supply itself, the price of polluting is the fine. That's why it's a perfectly elastic supply curve. It's perfectly flat. And that supply curve, that fine, is a Pigouvian tax, okay? Because if you didn't have the fine, then, and I'm going to erase this in a second, but essentially if the fine were zero, then the supply curve would be down here, right? That would be the fine. That would be the supply curve, and there would be a lot more polluting that takes place. But with the Pigouvian tax, now the supply curve is going to be up here where the fine is. Okay, so this is a Pigouvian tax or a Pigouvian fine on the pollution itself. Now, notice this. If companies decide that for whatever reason they want to increase production and therefore they're going to pollute more, that essentially shifts the demand for polluting out to the right. And that does not change the fine. The fine stays the same, but it will increase the quantity, and keep in mind what quantity is. It will increase the quantity of pollution that happens. There will be more pollution that's going to happen. Okay? So if the government uses a fine directly on the pollution itself, then they are giving up control of the quantity. The quantity is going to be determined by where the demand curve is. They have control over the fine, but they're giving up control over the quantity. The quantity is determined by the demand curve. Now, that then takes us to our third way of dealing with the pollution, and that is to create a new private property right. So we're going to create a private property right called pollution permits. We're going to issue permits, and you cannot pollute without the permit. Okay, you cannot pollute without the permit. Now, I'm sorry, down here, this is cut off over here, so let me fix that. The good itself is pollution permits. The good is pollution permits. Pollution permits, and I'm sorry, that's just cut off over here. Okay, so the good is pollution permits. So what that means is that if you own this permit, a permit might say that you can emit, say, 10,000 pollution particles into the air per month. Okay, and so if a factory needs to do that, then because they create pollution when they produce a good or service, they have to buy a permit. They have to buy a right to do it. Okay, so the good is now a pollution permit that gives you the right to pollute. If you don't own the pollution permit, you cannot engage in pollution. If you own the pollution permit, then you can produce goods and services and allow some pollution into the air based on the number of permits that you own. Okay? Now, the government sets the number of pollution permits that will exist, and that becomes the supply curve. So the supply curve is perfectly inelastic. The supply curve is set by the number of pollution permits that the government decides will exist. So if the government decides that there can be Q1 pollution permits, whatever that number is, maybe they'll issue 1,000 pollution permits, and that's it. Well, if you want to produce something, you're going to create pollution, then you're going to have to pay a price, because there's going to be a price of the permit. You're going to have to pay the price in the marketplace to buy the permit in order to be able to produce a good and engage in some pollution. If you can't afford to buy it, then you're going to have to clean up your factory. You're going to have to clean your smokestacks or whatever, so you don't create pollution, because you don't have a right to pollute without owning the permit. Now, watch what happens. And by the way, these pollution permits, they exist in the real world, and people can buy and sell them in the open marketplace. So if there is a demand, like we had a demand over here when there was a fine, we had a demand, and if the demand shifted to the right, that increased the amount of pollution that companies engaged in. Over here, it's going to be different. If you get an increase in demand, the demand curve shifts to the right. All that's going to do is drive up the price. That's going to drive up the price of pollution permits, but the amount of pollution will not change. So changes in demand will change the price, but it will not change the quantity. So in other words, with this cosine solution here, the government is controlling the amount of pollution, and they are giving up control over the price. They're giving up control over the price to the marketplace. All right? So there are three different ways in terms of the graphs to deal with the pollution. Three different ways to deal with it, and to do this, we've got to keep track of what the good is. Okay? One, you could have a Pigouvian tax on the good that creates the pollution, in this case widgets, okay? And that's the good. The second possibility is you can have a tax on pollution itself. That is the concept of a fine, and that's going to look like this graph where pollution itself is the good. And then finally, you can have a new right that you create, a right to pollute, a pollution permit. So now the pollution permit becomes the good. And so with each one of these, we are changing what the good is. We are changing what the good is that we are analyzing. All right, so I hope that helps understand these concepts. If I just go back here, I hope that helps understand these concepts of the possible choices available to governments through public policy. Okay, they can use the Pigouvian tax on the good that creates the pollution. They can do the Pigouvian tax based on the pollution itself, or they can create a new right, which is pollution permits. And I think I would say this. I think I would say, I don't want to speak for all economists, but I at least think some economists would say we prefer the cosine solution if we can make it work. We can't always, but if we could make it work, we'd like to, because then the market takes care of it. We would then say, okay, if that doesn't work, then a fine or a Pigouvian tax, that would be the next thing that we'd be willing to do. And then, finally, the command and control, that would kind of be our last choice. We try to avoid that if we can, a command and control way of doing it. All right, this has been Mr. Hagan on another Econ podcast. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next podcast.